My name's James Allred, and I'm going to tell some of the things I remember from my life, and I'm hoping that some of my grandchildren will be able to enjoy seeing this. The first thing I want to talk about is some of the experiences I had with Disneyland. Now, when I was growing up, my family lived in the town of Upland, California, which is about 45 minutes from LA and Anaheim. And being that close, we would periodically make trips out to Disneyland. Now, Disneyland was not the only place we ever visited, but it was one of the ones that I enjoyed going to most. Now, Disneyland opened in 1955, which was 1 year after I was born. It opened in July. I was born in February, the 10th of February, 1954. And I'm told that the year that it opened, my parents went, taking my two older sisters and I. I, of course, was too young to remember anything really of the event. However, I do remember when I was about 8 or maybe 9, there was a Scout Day at Disneyland. And as a Cub Scout, I went along with the rest of our pack and spent the day at Disneyland. I don't remember going around as a group. My memory seems to indicate that I went around pretty much on my own and just wandered around Disneyland. I remember visiting Mr. Toad's Wild Ride and also the Peter Pan ride. And one of the things I really enjoyed was the brand new attraction in Adventureland, the Tiki Hut or Tiki Room. And I remember going there and watching the pre-program, which was fascinating to me. I remember seeing the animatronic bird that was out front. It was only there for a short period of time. So the Tiki Room had just recently opened. And I remember going in and being just in love with the whole experience. I won't try to sing the songs of that for you, but it was a great deal of fun, and I enjoy going back, I'm sure. That's the earliest memory I have. Now, later on, when I was around, 12 or 13, I was in Scouts, and something happened that made it so I ended up going to Disneyland 3 times within 1 month. Now, at that time, my father was bishop of our ward, and we had a assignment at the welfare farm. Now, the welfare farm in the area where I grew up was a large orchard for growing oranges. and it had just had a large number of trees planted. These were too small to be bearing fruit yet. They were planted so that they could produce fruit later. Southern California was, and I believe still is, a large area for producing citrus fruit. Now, my father decided that I and my younger brother David were old enough to go and participate in this welfare assignment. We went down and, along with the elders' quorum, proceeded to hoe the weeds around the young saplings. David and I were assigned a row to work together, and all of the other brethren were assigned their own rows. And David and I were talking and working and moving along. It really didn't take very long to clear the weeds around each tree. And we kept on going and going. And because we were so involved with what we were doing and with our conversation, we didn't notice that we got away from everybody else. We were just going down one row. I don't know how long those rows were, but they were very long, and this was over an area of rolling hills. Not steep hills, just rather gentle hills that we really didn't notice going up or down. We were just having fun, talking, and clearing the weeds. I don't know how long it was when eventually our father came walking along the row and found us. And he let us know that we had outpaced everybody else, and the time was long past for us all to leave. Everybody else had left, and he'd come to find us. Well, afterwards, our father talked to David and I and said, "I am so proud of how hard you worked that I'm going to give you a special reward. You can have your choice of going to Knott's Berry Farm or Disneyland." David and I answered in unison, Disneyland. Knott's Berry Farm was fun, but we really loved going to Disneyland. So that was toward the beginning of that particular month. And then later in that month, well, it could have happened earlier than that. I can't remember the order that these events took place, but it was the same month. Our scout troop took a trip to Disneyland. It was a photographic expedition. Our scoutmaster had a photography shop and had given us instructions on how to properly take photographs. And we all had cameras, and we went out taking pictures around Disneyland. A good excuse to go to Disneyland. And we had a great time. That time, we were using the buddy system, I know for sure, because the boy that I was assigned to go around with, the only thing he wanted to do was to go to Autopia and drive the cars, and then get in line for Autopia again and drive the cars, and get in line for Autopia again and drive the cars. It was with great difficulty I got him to go and do anything else, like the submarine ride, or going to the Matterhorn, or to any of the other things that were there. We seemed to spend most of our time going back to Autopia and driving the cars. And since we were going together, well, it was drive the cars. Later that month, toward the end of the month, it was Mormon Night at Disneyland. And special tickets were sold through the seminaries and institutes. And because this was for a large group, we had a special discount. I don't know what the discount was. And at this time, the cost of going to Disneyland was not very high. It was still fairly low and quite affordable. Well, Mormon Night was pretty much that. It was night. We went just late in the day, and most of the park was cleared out by the regular guests, and it was just members of the church who were there, and perhaps some invited guests. I don't know. All I know is that we saw members of our warden stake all over the place. And Disneyland's pretty big, so it lets you know we had a huge turnout from our stake. We also had turnout from many, many, many other stakes. After all, this is the Los Angeles area, and large numbers of members were in that area. So as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we had all gathered there to experience Disneyland in the evening. And we had a great time. Now, one of the things I did that particular night was I went and got in line for the Matterhorn. Now, I have to remember this is the old lines and the old Matterhorn, so it looks a little different then from what it does now. But still, 2 bobsled rides, and I remember standing in line. Now, the way lines work is that the first people in the line will get into the ride vehicle and leave, and the whole line will gradually progress forward, sort of like the wave on a slinky as it moves back and forth. There'd be a space, everybody'd move forward a little bit, and the line would zigzag back and forth through switchback section as we got closer to the front of the line. Now, as we were standing in line, I was old enough, I guess, 12, 13 at the time, that I was allowed to go on my own. And I was standing in line in the switchbacks, and the different surges in the line would come, and first I'd be by one group of people on the other side of the switchback, and then I'd be by another group. And one of the times, there were some of the young men in our ward that I knew that were in the line suddenly on the other side of the switchback from me. And they had decided they were going to be tough. They were going to do terrible, wicked things like smoke. And they had their cigarettes, and they were puffing away at them. Not really quite as dramatic as some people I had seen, but they were holding their cigarettes. And then the line surged on the other side of them, and there was our bishop. And he said, "Boys, we're meeting in my office at church tomorrow morning before church." You never saw the cigarettes hit the ground so quick or get stamped out so quick. Luckily, that wasn't a worry for me, since I wasn't one of them smoking. I wasn't quite in that age group. But that was the 3 times I went to Disneyland, all in 1 month. And I enjoyed going there many, many more times. But I want to tell you some other stories. Yes. At one time, I took it into my head when I was around 13 that I did not like cheese. Why didn't I like cheese? As best as I can remember, or as well as I can remember, it was the word cheese. Something about the sound of it made me not like cheese. I did not want cheese on my sandwiches. I did not want cheese in anything I ate. I definitely did not want a cheeseburger. And I did not want cheesecake because it was cheesecake. A rather foolish position to take at the time, but I stuck to it very strongly. Now, being a scout at that time, we would go out on hikes and campouts. And there was one time we went on a hike, and it was a fairly long hike. And although we had had a lunch, I was hungry. I was very hungry by the end of the hike. We'd gotten back to the cars, and I said to the other boys in the troop, "Does anybody have anything to eat? I am just starved." And one of the boys says, "Well, I've got a piece of cheese. Anything." So he gave me a little tiny piece of cheese, and I devoured it. And oh, it was so good. Well, when we got home from our scout hike, I went in, and when are we going to eat? Because I was still pretty hungry. Oh, in a little while, you can find yourself a snack. So I went to the refrigerator. There was a block of cheese. I cut myself a nice slice of that cheese and started eating it. And my mother said, "James, you don't like cheese." "Well, of course I do." I had completely forgotten about my prejudice against cheese. Another story. Actually, this story is one that happened only a few years ago. About 5 years ago, this being the winter of 2019. So this took place about the year, I think, of 2008 or 2007. At any rate, I was working at the JCPenney Store Support Center, which was a big warehouse, located in Spanish Fork, right near the mouth of the canyon. Anyone familiar with that area will know that this was a large warehouse with multiple businesses operating in it, located right next to the windmill farm. Now, that particular year, we had a series of really heavy snowfalls. Now, I have 3 different stories involving snowfalls while working at that warehouse. And I haven't checked to see what the weather was which year. So this is circa 2008. So at any rate, one day I had driven on out, and it was still snowing somewhat as I was arriving at work. And the person who owned the building had not really gotten very much clear. And I was driving an old, I think it was an old Dodge, and anyway, it was an old red car that Donnell's parents had given to us. At any rate, I slowly drove up the hill and negotiated my way into the parking lot. I was one of the very first to arrive, and I went in and waited to clock in because I was just a little bit early. And there was some of the office staff there. And other people began to arrive, and a lot of them didn't know how to drive in snow. They tried to gun their engines and race up the hill, trying to go as quickly as they could, which caused their wheels to spin, creating ice instead of getting traction. And most people were stuck at the bottom of the hill, could not get up. Well, the man in charge, who was already there with the rest of the office staff, finally decided, we're not going to get the work team up here like we need. So we will not have work today, but everybody that shows up at the bottom of the hill will get a half-day pay. And then they looked at those of us who had gotten there already and said, you will get a full day's pay. So, yes, I'm glad I got there early and that I was able to make it up and get inside the building. There was another time when it snowed extremely hard and the parking lot was not clear. And so we were met, the road up had been cleared, but we were met at the gate by someone waving us on through the gate instead of over to the employee parking. And we were directed around the building to the back side where there was a ramp that went up to a door, a vehicle door that we could drive through into the building. And then we were directed to drive forward through the building, which was at this time mostly empty in this area. So here was this line of cars driving up, and then when we got to the wall separating the area that we worked for pennies, we parked our cars there inside the building and went through a door that was normally locked and got into the area where we worked. And we were able to go in and clock in and put in our day's work. And I really liked being able to park in the building. I wish we could have continued to do that, but it was the only time. And then there was another time that the snow had an effect on work. We had put in our work day, and at the end of shift, I'd gone home, and not long after, I got a phone call. Don't bother coming in to work tomorrow. We will call you and let you know when to come back into work. A section of the roof has collapsed. We can't work in the building until that's repaired. It was a fairly large hole that had opened because of the ice and snow that had built up on the roof of the building. And it took them a month to get that repaired. Now, the man who was in charge of our building worked hard with the company to convince them that they should not lay us off. They should keep us on the payroll so we wouldn't go and find other jobs, because they needed us with the skills we had developed. And there were a few times in the ensuing month that I got called in to come help with projects in the building. And I was able to see the hole and the icy wind and snow that were blowing around. And we worked at sorting out some of the items that were in there. It turned out, because of the damage that was done, this had also caused some flooding where the sprinkler system had been broken from the collapse of the roof, and the water had sprayed over a large area. And because of all of the damage, all of the merchandise in the building was declared damaged. Now, a lot of it was sitting on pallets well away from being where it would be damaged, but everything was declared damaged and was sold off to a discount retailer. And we had to get some of the things that were hanging up in various areas and consolidate them. I don't remember. I believe we had to put them back in boxes and then send them off to the discounter. So those are my 3 work stories with snow at the JCPenney warehouse. One of the other experiences I had when I was quite young, I was probably around 12 at the time of this experience, the first one. My father was, again, the bishop. Well, maybe not at that time. I think he might have been on the High Council. But at any rate, in those days, the high priest group were all the high priests that lived in your ward. The high priest quorum was all the high priests who lived in the stake. Now, I don't know whether it was just our ward or our stake high priest group, but they got together and decided that they wanted to go deep sea fishing. And we were close enough to the coast that that was not a great difficulty. And my father told me, now if you would like to, you can come with me on this fishing trip. But we have to leave very early in the morning, and you must get up when I call you. Well, the day came, and I had promised that I would get up. And I didn't want to get up. I was too sleepy. I was tired. But my father kept working with me, and he promised me that once we got into the car, I could lie down on the back seat and sleep. So I finally got dressed, got out to the car, and tried to lie down on the back seat. Well, my father was giving a ride to one of the other high priests, and that high priest came out and saw that I was in the car. And he said, "Can my son come?" My dad said, "Well, yes." So the guy went in, and almost immediately the other boy was out there waiting to get into the car while it was still dark at night. And this was during the summer, so you know dark at night meant early, early morning. And I was so ashamed of myself for not getting up like I had promised that I made it a point from then on that I was going to get up on time. Now, the upshot was that we went and had a great time going out on a fishing boat, a charter. I remember the name of the boat. It was called the Jet. And we started off early in the morning while it's still dark and went and picked up a tank full of bait fish. I believe they were anchovies. But anyway, live fish that were put into a large tank on the back deck of the charter boat. And then we headed out to sea. And it didn't take very long before the lights of the pier were just lost. But by this time, of course, it was beginning to get daylight. And we went along for quite some time. And I don't know how the owner of the boat, captain of the boat, knew where to go. They may have been using a fish-finding sonar. But we went out to a certain area where we were told, okay, start fishing. Now, I really didn't catch anything. I was having too much fun running around playing. But I was out there on the sea, watching the waves and enjoying the run of the ship. It really wasn't that big, I don't think. But at the age I was, it was plenty big enough for me. I just went from bow to stern. Now and then I might cast a line in with one of the anchovies on it. But I didn't really catch anything. I just enjoyed being with my dad and watching what was going on. Well, after most of the day was gone, with various success in fishing, we started to head back. It was about this time that the wind came up, and I was wearing a straw cowboy hat. If I remember right, it was a Roy Rogers hat, and I was wearing my Roy Rogers boots. I remember that. Anyway, the wind came up and blew my hat overboard. And it startled me, and I cried out, "My hat!" Well, they turned the boat around, and one of the men that worked on the boat grabbed a long pole with a hook on the end. I think those are called gaffs. But anyway, he was able to reach down and fish my hat up out of the water. As he was fishing it up out of the water, I realized I really didn't care that much about the hat. But I got my hat back, and we continued on home. Now, there is a sequel to the story. They decided that that fishing expedition was so fun and so successful, they would do another fishing expedition. I'm not sure how much time elapsed, but this time, children were being permitted. And I don't remember very much about other children going, except my two older sisters, Ruthann and Mildred. And this time, we had fun playing around on the boat, but we also did a bit more fishing. We'd try fishing on this side of the boat and that side of the boat. And generally, we'd fish for a while until the anchovy on our hook had disappeared, and then we'd go to another location. Now, I was not really very careful with my fishing pole. I thought I was being careful, but I didn't secure the hook and line. And so as I was walking with it over my shoulder, with the hook dangling on the line behind me, I happened to catch my sister Millie by her nose. Now, luckily, the hook didn't penetrate. At least I don't remember that it did. Millie might have a different version to the story. But I had to stop and hold still so my father could grab the line, lower it down, let the hook out of her nose, and then explain to me that if I was going to carry the pole around, I needed to attach the hook to the pole. And the pole had a cork lining to the handle to make it more comfortable to grip. And cork, of course, could easily take the point of the hook and secure it. So I learned something that day. Take care of your hook, and whatever you do, don't walk around with the hook dangling behind you. You might catch your sister. Now, I actually got along very well with my sisters. In fact, I'm going to deviate a little bit and tell some stories involving my older sisters. When I was very young, pretty much a toddler at this point, maybe a year old, maybe 18 months, I don't recall. But I do know that I had two older sisters. And my older sister, Millie, was walking around, and I was following her. My older sister, Ruth Ann, was also walking around the house, and Millie was following her. So there we went along our little train, Ruth Ann and Millie and I. We'd walk from one room to another. We'd walk into the front room, wander around it. We went out the front door, walked around the yard, and then Ruth Ann turned around, marched back into the house, being followed by Millie, and Millie being followed by me. And we went back into the kitchen, where Ruth Ann said, "Mom, Millie and James are following me." Actually, at this point, it was Mildred. Millie hadn't come along yet. We didn't call her Millie until many years later. But Mom tried to explain to Ruth Ann that, well, they like you, and so they're following you. She wanted us to stop. That's pretty much all I remember of that particular incident. But later on, when Ruth Ann and Mildred were in elementary school, and I wasn't out of kindergarten yet, they were learning to read. And nothing would do, but they had to play school and teach their little brother to read. And of course, I wasn't really ready to at the time, and I had a terrible time. I don't remember it being that terrible, but my sisters assure me that I had a terrible time learning to read as they were teaching me. So, they taught me to read. Well, eventually, I got into the first grade, and they continued to teach me to read. And I was having classes in reading, and I believe my teacher was Miss Sweetland. At any rate, I worked at reading, and I worked at reading, and I had a book about the dog Lassie, based on the television show, which was quite popular at the time. And I went through that book again and again and again until I'd gotten fairly proficient at reading that story. I was so proud of myself. I wanted to go show my teacher that I could read this book. Well, my mother called up the teacher and arranged for me to go over to her house to read to her. She was busy working at fixing dinner for her family. And so I sat down in the kitchen and proceeded to try and read the book. Not quite as smoothly and eloquently as I had thought I could, but I was able to do a passable pass at reading the book. Now, I was still in first grade, so it wasn't that urgent of a thing, I suppose. But later on, I was in second grade. Really time to start learning to read, or to progress in our reading. Now, there were two things that had occurred. One, I was exposed to large numbers of books at home. Dr. Seuss was very popular, and we had pretty much all of the books that had been published up to that time. And also, my older sisters and I had developed a fascination with keys. Keys were what adults had, and keys let you go through locked doors. And keys were what showed you were an adult, because you had keys. And we had a few old keys that really didn't go to anything anymore. The locks had been changed and only the keys remained. So we played with them. But we also played with keys for various canned items. Now, in those days, a lot of products, nuts or other products, could be dry packed in a can, and then you used one of these keys. We frequently called them spam can keys because they were often on the spam cans so that you could open those up. Far cry from the pull tabs of nowadays. But by getting the little tab into the slot on the key, you could start turning it and turning it and turning it, and gradually wind up a metal strip that was made to pull off so that you could open the can. And then we would very carefully unwind the metal strip from the key so we could have the key. And those little metal strips were sharp. We had to be very careful. But we amassed a large number of these spam can keys. Now, I'm calling them spam can keys, but they were also for keys for cans of nuts and other dry or wet goods, including canned hams. So we had a large number of these keys, and I suppose we would trade them or something, but they were our prized possessions. Now, my mother had grown up in a family that reading was very important, and she wanted to encourage us to read. So she came in and confiscated every single key of whatever variety it was. Now, she gave us the ultimatum. If you want a key, you must read a book. If you read a book like The Cat in the Hat, you get one of the spam can keys. If you collect 10 spam can keys, you could get one of the keys that didn't go to anything. And if you collected 10 of those, you could get a key to the house. Now, why was that important to me as a child? Well, Millie, or Mildred, had discovered that while we were out playing, she could go inside and lock us out. And she could have the whole house to herself. Well, we were not happy with being locked out. And we demanded keys to the house. And this is, I think, what triggered our mother's plan for encouraging us to read. So that was the reason she offered us a key to the house as the ultimate prize, if we were able to gather 10 of the keys that didn't go to anything, or their equivalent in spam can keys. Well, as soon as the ultimatum was given, I sat right down with every Dr. Seuss book we had and read them all. And then I realized I wasn't getting keys fast enough. I wanted that key to the house. So I pointed my mother's attention to the bookcase and said, "What if I read one of these books?" Pointing at some of the thick books like Tom Sawyer and a few others that we had. In fact, because my sisters were avid readers, they had accumulated several copies of the Nancy Drew Mysteries. Well, if I was going to read those thick books, then I could get one of the regular keys that didn't go to anything. So I dove into Nancy Drew and Tom Sawyer and read and read and read. And after a while, I was grabbing the books to read, completely forgetting about getting a key. Eventually, I did get a key to the house. But by that point, I was grabbing books to read and insisting on going to the library to get more books to read. And finding that if I didn't have anything to read at the breakfast table, I'd read the boxes of cereal. And so my reading addiction got started. And I would read and read everything. And when I was 10 years old, I found a really, really thick book that we had in our library. I had never read it. It was called The Yearling by, I believe it was Marjorie Rawlings. And I decided I was going to read that book, especially when I discovered that it was basically the story of a young boy. So I started reading that. Now, it was heavy going for me at the time, at 10 years old. But after I'd got tired of reading that book, I'd go read something else for a while. Then I would come back and I'd pick up again, reading the adventures of Jody and his young deer. I'm glad I did. And I'm glad I read it again several times because I really enjoyed it more with each reading. Now, one of the results of this reading addiction was I was permitted to walk downtown to the brand new Upland Library. It's probably been replaced by now, I don't know, because our family moved away from Upland many years ago. But at the time, growing up in Upland, I knew how to walk downtown. And I would, that summer, go to the library and start checking out books. Now, I wanted the grown-up books, the adult books. And so I was going to the library stacks or shelves, and I'd started at the A's and began working my way through the books. And I would select 3 books, go up to the desk with my library card, check out the books, and walk home, frequently reading one of the books on the way. And I would read the books the rest of the day, and then I would take the books I'd finished back to the library, select 3 more books, check them out, and walk home, reading one of the books on the way. And I did this day after day after day. Not on Sundays, but for many, many days, I would go check out 3 books, walk home, read the books, bring the books back the next day, and after a while, the librarians asked me, "Why do you only check out 3 books?" And I pointed to the sign on the desk, and I said, "That says that children under 12 may only check out 3 books at a time. And I'm not 12 yet." The librarians looked at each other, then they looked back at me and told me, "That rule does not apply to you anymore. You may check out as many books as you can carry." I was still not as tall as I am now at the time, at 10 years old, but I stacked books from my chin down to as low as my arms could reach and walked home. I was in 7th heaven. I had books to read. And to get through all those books did take up the rest of the week, which I think was part of the plan of the librarians, aside from also wanting to encourage me in my reading. So, I don't remember very much of those books. Most of them were not that memorable, but I read them and I enjoyed them. And then my peculiar reading habit of sneaking into the adult section had an interesting side effect. I was going along, having started at the letter A, and was moving down the shelves, and I had finally gotten to another letter in the alphabet, and oh dear, now I'm trying to remember the name of the author. But this author had written The 3 Musketeers, which I devoured. I enjoyed that. And I read The Man in the Iron Mask, and I enjoyed that. But he'd also written something called The Count of Monte Cristo. Well, I found that book in the library, a nice book of The Count of Monte Cristo, and I took it home, and it was pretty good, except there were some things that were sort of confusing to me. But I took it back to the library, and I went to see if there was anything else by this author. And I found a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. It was thicker than the one I had checked out. What's going on here? It's got smaller print, yet it's thicker. I didn't realize that there was such a thing as abridged books. So I took The Count of Monte Cristo home and read it again. There was so much more to the story. Suddenly, a minor character was a major character. Suddenly, I was finding out all sorts of things about what went on in the story. Wow, it was a great story now. So I went back to the library and turned that copy in, went back to the shelf for the author, and I found The Count of Monte Cristo. Wait a minute, this was 2 times as thick. So I checked it out, and I read it. Wow! There was so much more to the story. There were new characters that I'd never heard of before. New things happening. It was incredible. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that. And that was my introduction to books that had been condensed, abridged. Now, thinking of abridged books brings me to an entirely different story. I had been given a copy of the Book of Mormon when I was 8, having been baptized. And I don't know that it was then. I think it was actually when I became a deacon at 12 that I had a challenge from our home teacher. He asked me, "Have you ever read the Book of Mormon all the way through?" No. Okay, I want you to read a chapter a day. And at 6 o'clock every night, you were to call me up and tell me about the chapter you read. Okay. And so each day, with a little reminder from my mother, I would read my chapter. Then I would go make the phone call and explain what the chapter had been about. Some of those chapters were really, really long. But eventually, at a chapter a day, I finished. And I was able to report on the last chapter in Moroni. Since then, I've read the Book of Mormon many, many times from beginning to end, and I spend a lot of time going through and studying various topics in not only the Book of Mormon, but the Bible and the Doctrine and Covenants and the Pearl of Great Price, all of which I have read from cover to cover. The Old Testament I've only gone through cover to cover once, but I keep referring back to it because there are so many good scriptures in there. And now I carry my scriptures on this, my iPad, which I got fairly recently. And the only way I could get it was working at the place I do now, which is called Entrada, or the Leasing Center. I worked there for about 3 years, carefully saving up the reward points that I earned, because they had a value that could be exchanged for items. And one of the items was an iPad. Well, I hadn't quite got there. I needed at least 100 reward points. Well, they kept changing the different items you could get. And finally, they just said, "We're going to do gift cards." And I had gotten really close to getting that iPad. Well, I talked to my supervisor, and he talked to his supervisor, and they agreed that they would get me a special gift card for Apple, which was not one of the regular ones they offered, so that I could order my iPad. And it was now, my points were worth about $600. And I not only was able to get the iPad, but a special case with a keyboard. Why didn't I get the iPencil? Because I was more interested in being able to write my stories than to color. Maybe someday I'll get myself some sort of stylus that will work on the iPad. But right now, I really enjoy using my iPad with its keyboard cover. And I think I'm going to find a different topic. I've told you a lot of stories that weren't even on my list. Okay. Well, back to when I was a scout. My scout troop at one time decided to go on a special extended week-long, or maybe it was 2 weeks, but we went on a camp out where we were hiking down into the Havasu Canyon, which is the Havasupai Indian Reservation. Now, the trail is 13 miles long from the parking area down into the area that we were going to camp, which was very close to the Havasu Falls and the Navajo Falls and the Mooney Falls, all of which have their own little story. But we hiked on down. And at that time, my scoutmaster was named Harry Heron, a really funny sounding name. But he was our scoutmaster, and although the name was somewhat humorous, we were used to it. As we were hiking down, we got into a narrow part of the canyon where there was some shade. And we stopped there to rest, and another scout troop coming up out of the canyon came along. Well, our scoutmaster started talking to their scoutmaster, and they found out that their names were both Harry Heron. And they sat down and did some discussion about family history and genealogy and discovered out that they were, in fact, distant cousins. That is, having a common great-grandfather. So, you can never tell what's going to happen. Havasu Canyon was a great place to go camping. The pools of water that formed around the waterfalls were wonderful. The water of the Havasu River, which empties into the Colorado, is of high mineral content, producing travertine rocks that would gradually build up as the water passed through its riverbed. And as it came down off the falls, a spray would go up, and the travertine in the water would be left as the water evaporated in the dry air, and it would fall down in a great big circle around the waterfall, creating a ring and a shallow pool. And then little waterfalls would go off of that ring, creating other little rings, and on down. I understand that when there's a large amount of water come down, it can wipe out some of these features. But at that time, there were a large number of these pools, and it was a wonderful place to go swimming. In fact, there was a place down where the river was leaving from the falls we were at, the Havasu Falls, and going on down to another fall. But the river was deep enough that we could go on a rope swing, which was loads of fun. Now, the rock was rough, and so we had to wear tennis shoes to walk on the rocks, and we just climbed all over these rock formations, and we'd get down into the various pools. Some of the pools were sort of like hot tubs. They weren't hot, but it was a small little pool that we could get in, and the water would just cascade down on us. It was a wonderful place to go. Now, further on the canyon, leading on the way down to the Colorado River, there was another fall called Mooney Falls. Now, I don't think I myself made it all the way down to the Colorado, although some people did. But I did go down to Mooney Falls. And Mooney Falls, you had to go down a very steep cliff. The trail had been worked and improved so that you could go down, and there was a chain embedded in the rock every few places. It was attached, and holding on to the chain, you could help yourself go down or climb up. Now, Mooney Falls had not always had this trail, and at one time, someone was coming down and decided to rappel down next to the falls so he could get down to the pool of water below. And as close as I can remember the story, his name was Mooney. Yes, he did die, and the falls ended up being named after him. But I don't remember all the details of that. Anyway, I'm bringing up story after story that aren't on my list, but I think it's time to go to another one. Well, I've already told some of these stories. Yes. When I was around 9 or 10, and I think I must have been 10, maybe 11, and my brother David was a year younger than I. My father was asked by the company he worked for to go on a special trip back to Chicago to negotiate a contract with the union. That's where the union headquarters were, in Chicago. Well, I'm not sure. There may have been other reasons for going on the trip, but the company was willing to pay my father first-class airfare to travel and accommodations in a very nice hotel in Chicago. My father went to the head of the company and said, which was a Bonham. Anyway, he negotiated that what my father would do would be to take his 2 weeks vacation, and then he would drive himself and our family out on a trip across the country and take care of the business in Chicago and drive back. So we went on a road trip, a real great road trip. Now, my father was very into our education, and he felt that this was going to be a great opportunity for us. So my youngest brother at the time, Joseph, was left with my grandparents, and David, myself, Mildred, and Ruth Ann were loaded into the back of our Greenbrier bus, which was blue with a broad white stripe around the middle. And the seat in the back was taken out, and the mattress from my parents' bed was laid in the place so that we had a large area that we could lie down in. Seat belts were not a thing yet. And we rode in the back of that van, driving from Southern California across the southern states, following Route 66 and other roads. And we had our camping gear tied on top, and we'd only stopped for gas and restrooms, and we traveled across Nevada and Arizona and Texas and Tennessee. And we would stop at various places, usually trying to camp because that was cheaper. But if campgrounds were not available, we'd find a motel somewhere. And in that way, we progressed traveling across the country. Now, I'm going to tell the whole trip, and then I'm going to come back and tell individual stories about different things. But I remember it took forever to travel across Texas, and we were only cutting across the Panhandle. And then we got into some of the southern states, and I don't clearly remember which states we actually traveled through. I'm sure we went through Tennessee and Georgia, and as we got to the eastern part of the country, where we pretty much would have run into the Atlantic Ocean, we went with the highway system and headed north and passed through Virginia and visited Washington, D.C. We only spent about a day there. I remember driving around, seeing the Capitol building and the White House, and I remember going with my father and probably my sisters and my brother and climbing up in the Washington Monument. And all of this was very impressive to me. And then we went on back down. And then, there was at that time, and still is, an elevator inside the Washington Monument. The elevator only took you up. You had to walk down the stairs. And then after we left Washington, we started heading back west. I suppose we may have passed through New Jersey, and we may have gotten into New York. I don't know. It became a church history tour around this point, and I remember going and visiting the Carthage jail. And I remember going and visiting Nauvoo. Now, the Nauvoo temple had not been rebuilt at that time, but they showed us the place, and they showed us some of the stones that still existed and told us the story about the Nauvoo temple. And we stopped at a few other places. But this was Illinois. Chicago. We drove up to Chicago, where my father went to have his meeting. I don't remember everything we did while we were in Chicago waiting for my father, but after the meeting that night, we went to a particular building and we were going out to dinner. There was a rooftop restaurant at this building. Now, this particular building, which no longer exists, the rooftop restaurant was on a turntable. That is, the dining area was. And we went up the elevator, which only had a gate across it. So you could see the various floors as you went up. And I remember counting the floors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 11, 12, and a blank wall. And then the 14th floor. I don't remember how many floors we actually ended up going, but I thought it was so strange that they didn't have a 13th floor. Enough people were superstitious about the number 13 that although the 13th floor technically existed, it was not one that businesses wanted to be on. Anyway, we ate dinner in the rotating dining area, getting a panoramic view of Chicago. And that was my great memory of Chicago. We drove home across the plains, and this time when we crossed the Mississippi, it was tiny. I don't really remember that. I only remembered crossing it down lower as we were leaving Kentucky. However, we finally got back to the western states, Oregon and Washington, Oregon, and down into California. And we drove the Coast Highway, and I remember getting to San Francisco and crossing the Golden Gate Bridge and seeing what was left of the great exhibition that had been there in San Francisco, the World's Fair. We didn't go over to that particular location. We looked across the pond at the buildings. But that was our trip to San Francisco. And I believe we stopped at the Golden Gate Bridge so we could get out and walk around a little bit. We didn't walk across it. But we did drive across it, and we visited Fisherman's Wharf. And then we headed on down south, eventually passing through Los Angeles and returning home to Upland. Now, some of the particulars about that trip that I've sort of skipped over. On this trip, my father decided that their telling stories and singing songs was not going to do it for getting 4 children all the way on the trip. And so he allowed us to have comic books. We didn't have comic books at that time. Now, I wanted the Superman comic books. No, we had the Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck comic books, which we all traded around reading. And sometimes our mother would read to us out of a book that she had. But mostly it was watching the scenery, playing the license plate game, getting all the letters of the alphabet and all the numbers from 1 to 10, and watching as the state signs would go by, now entering Nevada, now entering Arizona, now entering Texas, and trying to find all the letters of the alphabet on the billboards that were along the highway. And sometimes we had to wait quite a long time between billboards because, of course, they're only close to cities. Okay. One day, as we had been driving, and it was getting rather late and dark, we came to a town and found that there were no vacancies at the motels. We drove through the town looking for a place with a vacancy, but no vacancies. I don't remember the name of the town, but I do remember that we were leaving the town and it was getting sort of late. And we finally found a motel that had a vacancy. Only one room. But it was the only place we could stay. There were no campgrounds nearby. And they knew they had the only room in town, so they charged a premium price for it. I don't know what the price was, but we ended up staying there that night. And it was a rather shabby place. And the next morning, we saw that there was a courtyard area or backyard area with grass. And so we wanted to go out in the grass. And I was used to going barefoot at home. We had a nice soft grass. This was all prickly and stubbly. Ugh. And it really wasn't a very fun place to be. Although it looked like it had a lawn, it was mowed down weeds. Anyway, we finally left there, and we drove all that day. And we came to another town, and the same sort of situation. No vacancy, no vacancy, no vacancy. We got through town. Motels on this side of town, no vacancy, no vacancy. Finally, we saw one, vacancy. We pulled on in, and my father went walking in, and we could see through the window the man who was in the office going, "Oh no," and he ran over and turned on the no sign for no vacancy. But he was a kind-hearted man, and he realized that we had only gotten there because he had forgotten to turn on the no vacancy sign. Now, this hotel was in fact the property of a Major League Baseball player. This was his hometown. And he lived at the hotel, unless he was out playing baseball with the team, which he was. And the manager of the hotel, or motel, said that since it was his fault, he would let us stay in the owner's suite. Whoa. We ended up paying exactly what we had the night before for a dump. And now we had multiple bedrooms, a living room area, a kitchen. Well, it was great. We had a wonderful time there. All for the same price. We went from a dump to a palace. Now, another story about this trip. As we were traveling along, and we got into some of the states, Texas and Tennessee and Kentucky, the summer thunderstorm season was upon us. And every now and then, my sister Millie would really get rather upset at David and I. Mildred would just get so mad, and she'd be frustrated, and she'd scream and shake her arms, and because of the frequent thunderstorms, we called it her rain dance, because she'd get into doing that and it would start raining again. I think David and I took it a little too far. We probably teased her a little bit more than necessary, than we normally would have, just so she would do her rain dance again. However, that was the traveling by car at that time. Now, at that time also, my Aunt Mildred, who my sister was named after, was living in Kentucky. And so we made the detour. I don't know if it was much of a detour, but we stopped in Kentucky where my Aunt Mildred was living with my Uncle Boyd. Now, my cousins, Cheryl and Jill, I don't know if they were living in Kentucky at the time or if they were off somewhere else. Being a bit older than us, they may have been going to school elsewhere. But they could have been there. All I remember was visiting with Aunt Mildred and Uncle Boyd, and we stayed there that night, and they had fireflies. I had never really seen fireflies before, and we just loved catching them and seeing them flash their lights. It was a wonderful experience. We played with some of the neighboring children right next to a large field where the fireflies would zoom around. Well, it was a great experience. And my Aunt Mildred told me a joke, which I memorized. I loved that joke. And she later said she wished she'd never told it to me because every time I saw her, I would repeat the same joke. The joke was, what did the firefly say when it backed into the fan? Oh, I'm delighted. No end. Yes, a Shaggy Dog story. A story set up to tell a pun. Well, I've always liked puns. So, there's that. Now, at this time also, my Uncle Wayne, my mother's brother, was living in one of these areas, and we went and stayed at their house. They had a swimming pool in the backyard. It was an above-ground swimming pool, something I'd never seen before. But we had a great time there, and our father had obtained at one of the gas stations a little model boat, actually pretty big. It was a model of one of the oil tankers that would bring crude oil from other countries, mostly in the Arabian Peninsula. And it was battery operated and could actually float in the water and cruise around. And we would play with that, sending it back and forth to each other and try to get it to sail in a curve because we could adjust the rudder a little bit. And it was while we were there that I saw one of the hailstorms that are famous for that area of the country. And the hailstones were pretty big. I I found out since then that they can be much, much bigger. But we were really impressed by the size of those hailstones. Luckily, they didn't damage our vehicle. I understand that the hailstones in some places can be so big and come with such a rapidity that they will damage the car, chipping the paint off and cracking the windshield. At any rate, we had a good time visiting with my cousins, Ken and Doug Barker. Well, that was pretty much the stories I had for that trip. And thinking of my cousins Ken and Doug and Marina and Sabrina, I'm reminded of other stories. Now, when I was very small, we lived in Upland, but the church building was in Ontario, a neighboring town, and not really very far away. In fact, if it wasn't for the sign saying this is the boundary of the city, you wouldn't know. The main street for Upland was the main street for Ontario, Euclid Avenue. And there are stories about that. But when I was very young, perhaps 1 to 2 years old, a new church building was constructed. And it was built on an adjoining piece of property. It had a nice, beautiful new church building. It had an open courtyard in the middle. An open courtyard in the middle, which just seemed the most natural thing to me, being in Southern California. After all, that's the way the high school and elementary school were built. Not with a courtyard in the middle, but when you were in the classrooms, you were in the classrooms. When you were out of the classrooms, you were outdoors. That was just the way it was, after all, with all the nice sunny weather we had. Why would you build hallways and such? But I can remember vaguely going in the old building, which actually now had been cleared of all of the benches or pews, and seeing that, and then going in and seeing the new building. And that was the building I can remember, the Ontario Ward building. And at that time, when I was still very young, only around 1 or 2, my Uncle Wayne was in fact the bishop. And he had a job that was going to take him to Holland. And so a new bishop was going to need to be called. And of course, there was a lot of speculation. Who's going to be the bishop? Who's going to be the bishop? Well, I'm going to tell this story. It's actually my father's story. My father, along with everybody else wondering who was going to be the new bishop, had retired to bed, and he and my mother were lying there in the dark room when suddenly, my father said, it was revealed to him that he was to be the next bishop, and that a general authority would come to our home to issue the call. Well, he's sitting there thinking about it when my mother speaks up and says, "You're going to be the next bishop. It's just been revealed to me." And of course, you don't go to the stake president and say, "I'm to be the next bishop." So they didn't say anything to anyone, and they just waited for events. All they knew was a general with authority was to come to the house to issue the call. Well, days went by and days went by. It was finally, I believe, the Saturday before the conference, the stake conference, when the new bishop had to be announced, and nothing had happened. My father had gotten dressed that morning in a suit, and finally he couldn't stand it anymore, and he says, "I'm going off to work. Let me know when they contact you." Well, he got to work, and I don't know that he was there very long, but a phone call came. It was the stake president. "How quickly can you get home?" "Well, I can be there in 15 minutes. Can't you get here any faster?" "Not without breaking the speed limit." "Okay, well, we're here at your house. Please come home." And so my father drove home. Now, our house in Upland was on the corner of Ukiah Way. I think Arrow Avenue was the cross street, although I may be wrong about that. But we were on Ukiah Way at the corner, just downhill from the high school. Now, being on the corner, my father drove home, and he parked at one side of the house and came through the kitchen door into the house and into the front room where my mother was with the stake presidency, just the stake presidency. And they visited for a little while. And after a while, stake president gets up and says, "Well, we have to be on our way." And they get to the front door, and the stake president says, "By the way, Elder Kimball is in the car and would like to meet with you." So they all went out to the car, where Elder Kimball was sitting waiting in the car. And then they, with Elder Kimball, walked back up to the house. As they got to the front door, Elder Kimball said, "Brethren, I waited in the car while you were in the house visiting. It's your turn to wait in the car." And then he came on in. Now, my memory of what my father said happened is that Elder Kimball, Spencer W. Kimball, Spencer Woolley Kimball, was to turn to my parents and say, "I know that you know why I'm here." And then he told them that it had been revealed to them that my father was to be the bishop so that they could be ready for the call. And this is how my father ended up being the bishop of the Ontario ward, and why my priesthood line of authority through my father goes through Spencer W. Kimball, who became the 12th president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Something that I'm very grateful for is that my line of authority has always remained exactly the same, being ordained a deacon, a teacher, a priest, and an elder, and a high priest by my father. What else can I tell you? There are probably more stories that I could think of, but I'm going to go to my list and see if I can come up with something else. There was a year when my father decided to buy the new latest thing, a plastic Christmas tree, an artificial Christmas tree. They had not existed for very long. And this one he got from Sears was a white plastic Christmas tree, pure white. And at this time, we had a low table, a children's table was basically what it was, a play table. And this was used to set the Christmas tree up on. Now, I just thought it was to make it look fantastic, but I'm sure my parents were probably doing this to try and keep it out of the reach of little fingers. And having put it together, my father decided he and mother needed to go to the store for something. I think it might have been for some more ornaments. I don't know. Maybe they needed to go get food. At any rate, Ruthann, Mildred, and myself were left at home with the tree sitting up on top of the play table as our parents took off with David and Joseph. And, well, actually, maybe Joseph wasn't born yet. I think David went just because he was the baby at the time. All I know is that I was still very small. And my older sisters decided that we should decorate the tree as a surprise for our parents. So, since the boxes of ornaments were right there, we started decorating the tree. And being the little toddler, I could barely reach the lowest branches. And I started putting ornaments on the lowest branches. And being a toddler, I was grouping them all together in one spot. However, Ruthann and Mildred would take them and spread them more evenly around the tree. And it was starting to look pretty good with the ornaments hanging on it. We eventually got all the ornaments on. All except the star, which was to go at the top of the tree. Well, Ruthann, being the oldest and tallest at the time, got an old high chair that we used. Now, the high chair had lost its back, and I don't know what had ever happened to the tray on it. We would just let the smallest children sit in it up at the table. And she brought the chair over next to the tree and stood up on the seat, which now let her be at the same height as the top of the tree. And she had the star, and she reached out to put it on the tree. But trees are cone-shaped, so the tree was sloping away from her, and she couldn't quite reach. So she stretched a little further, almost, a little further, got the star on the tree, and fell down into the tree, knocking it off the table, crashing to the floor, and smashing almost every ornament we had. I don't remember how long it was before our parents came home, but Mom and Dad took care of Ruthann, cleaned up the broken ornaments, rescuing what few might have survived. and explained to us that you don't put the ornaments on until after the lights are on. And my father had to go and buy replacement branches for our tree. Since we just bought it at Sears and he had the receipt, he was able to get replacement branches. But there was always one place that the stub that the branch was to go on had broken. And so there was always that little gap at the bottom of the tree, which we always turned away back toward the wall, or actually windows, since we decorated the tree toward the windows or next to the windows that looked into the backyard of our home. So that was our big experience with decorating the tree when I was a little child. As I got older, I decorated the tree many times. And even as I got tall enough, I was the one who strung the lights on the tree and helped put the lights up around the eaves of our house. Now, the outdoor lights were pretty big. Bulbs were about that tall. And the indoor lights, they were about that tall. And being hot, our mother would carefully hold the youngest child near the tree, near one of the lights that was not quite as hot as the others, and allow the baby to reach out and grab that light. Because, of course, that's what a baby's going to do, want to grab the light. Well, it wasn't the hottest one. Those were the white ones. But it was one of the cooler ones, a blue or green. And, of course, it was hot. And the baby would let go and cry and never want to touch the lights again. Which I thought was a pretty good way of teaching not to grab the lights. Nowadays, lights are tiny, usually LEDs, and they're not hot. So trying to convince little kids not to grab the lights is another problem. But one we've survived. All right. Well, what other stories have I got? When I was growing up, our family would go on an annual camp out to the Sequoia National Park, out among the giant redwoods. We would hike around and see the General Sherman tree and the various trails, go around the Crescent Meadow. And we loved going there and spending time as a family. And we'd always camp out at the Sunset Campground, a campground which is no longer available for camping. And near this campground was Sunset Rock, a very, very large outcropping of granite, so big that you could fit a fairly good-sized building out on that granite outcropping. And we would play all over that big, huge outcropping of granite. And it was loads of fun for us as children. And we were camped close enough usually that our parents could call and we would hear them and we'd come running for meals. One day, as we had been playing at the camp at Sunset Rock, we got called to go back, or it was time to go back, I'm not sure which. And we all headed back. Now, I was in Scouts. I knew that you weren't supposed to cut trail. This was one of the cardinal rules of hiking. You don't cut trail, which meant you always followed and stayed on the trail. You didn't try taking little shortcuts, because this could damage the mountainside and cause problems with erosion. Well, my older sister Ruth Ann was also very much into woodscraft. She had been a Girl Scout, and she was very much into wanting to become a forest ranger. At any rate, she and I agreed that we should not cut trail. We should go on the actual real trail. So while our brothers and sisters raced off between the trees, cutting trail to get back to camp, we proceeded to go along the trail. What we didn't realize was that the correct trail was actually covered with pine needles, so that we couldn't find it. And we walked along the paved trail that connected the campgrounds, looking for the correct trail that would lead back to our campground. Now, I was 15 at this time. I remember that clearly. And as we walked along, we got further and further from our campsite. And my sister, being an intelligent young woman, decided that she should stop and ask for directions. The only problem being that we had moved so far from our campsite that the person she asked had no idea where our campsite was. Now, about this time, as a 15-year-old, I had been thinking that Joseph Smith, when he was 14, went out and prayed and got an answer. I was 15. I could pray and get an answer. So I knelt down by the side of the trail and prayed, what should I do? Now, I had recognized one of the campsites nearby as being one that I had been at before. And I knew where that was in relationship to the campsite where we were. And I got the clear impression, get up, walk onto the road, and go down the road to your campsite. But that will leave Ruth Ann out here alone. She will follow you. Just get up and head down the road to your camp. So I got up and headed down the road, with Ruth Ann calling, James, James, come back, James, as she followed me down the road all the way to the campground. Simple story, but it was praying and getting an answer. One of my first experiences with that. Well, about 5 years later, when I was 20, I was going on a mission. And I had been called to an English-speaking mission. Little did I know, but it was Ireland. At any rate, I went to the Salt Lake Mission Home for the 2-week time period I would spend before actually traveling to my field of service. And we had various classes, but this was English speaking, so we weren't learning to speak another language, but we were studying the gospel and beginning to learn the discussions which were used at that time. Now, while there, they told us that on a certain day, we would go and do some sessions in the temple, and after the sessions, we would go up to the solemn assembly room of the Salt Lake Temple, where a general authority would address us. We didn't know what general authority yet. Anyway, that was still in the future. We continued our classes and living at the Salt Lake Mission Home. And pretty much trying to prepare for my mission, wishing that I'd read the Ensign and the New Era more beforehand. Well, the time was coming, and they announced that aside from the being addressed by a general authority, the general authority would have a question and answer session. And we could think of questions, and if we got one of the microphones, we would be allowed to ask our question. Well, it was at this time when I realized I had two questions that had to do with the temple. And they weren't really something I could ask outside the temple. At least I didn't feel so. And I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know for sure I'd get one of the microphones. So the night before, in my personal prayer, I prayed basically the words, Father in heaven, you know what my questions are. And I know that you give revelation to the leaders of your church. Please inspire the person who speaks to us to talk specifically about one of my questions. And then, if you could just bless me to get one of the microphones during the question and answer session, I will ask the other. Well, the next day came. We did our temple sessions, and then we climbed up the stairs in the towers up to the solemn assembly room, which I think we pretty much filled. And then one of the men picked up two microphones, handed one to an elder way over there. He walked across the room and handed me the second microphone, telling me, you will have the second question. After you've asked the question, hand it to the elder on your right. So I had a microphone. And we were sitting there waiting for a general authority to come. Eventually, into the room walked Harold B. Lee, the president of the church. The president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had decided that he was going to come and address the missionaries. And he spoke specifically about one of my questions. And then I got to ask the other question. The questions weren't important and aren't important. What was important is that by faith I was able to ask my Heavenly Father for certain things to happen. And he inspired his prophet. And he inspired the man who was handing out the microphones. So, do I have a testimony of God? Do I have a testimony of revelation? Yes, completely, undoubtedly. Another story from when I was very young. Now, back when I was around 3 or 4, many of the department stores would have not only the clothing and other items that could be purchased, but a candy counter. Every Sears store had a candy counter, usually located in the middle of the store. And the candy counter, in fact, was a fixture in the stores for a good number of years, and only disappeared, it was sometime in the 70s. They may have started going out earlier than that, but I believe I can recall a candy counter in the Provost Sears store, which was located close to where the Smith's Food is now, not too far from the 4th District Courthouse and the new 4th District Courthouse, which has been recently built. I don't know whatever is going to be built on that site now. The building has been long torn down for the Sears store. But anyway, when I was about maybe 4, my family took a trip to the local Sears store, and I was following my parents and my sisters through the store, and something got my attention, and I looked off to the side for a moment, and when I turned back, I couldn't see my parents. I couldn't see my sisters. And this traumatic experience as a 4-year-old got me crying. And I was just really bawling. And somebody came over and, "What's the matter?" "I lost my parents. They're gone." Well, I was taken over to the candy counter, which was also a service counter and register. And I was crying so hard and sobbing so hard that they couldn't get out of me what my name was. So they gave me a donut. And having a donut, I took a bite, and I stopped crying, and they were able to find out that my name was James. And so on the speaker system, they announced, "There's a little boy named James wearing a striped shirt at the candy counter. Will his parents please come and get him?" And not long later, my parents showed up with my sisters, Ruth Ann and Mildred. And Ruth Ann and Mildred were really indignant that I had a donut and they didn't get one. But that was my experience of being lost at the store. And how I was found again. Boy. Ah, yes. The exciting ambulance ride. When I was around 10, I believe, I would ride my bicycle back and forth to the elementary school, which was several blocks away. And I just loved riding my bicycle. I really enjoyed riding up and down our street and riding out to the elementary school where I would park it. And one day, I was riding home, and I would ride along the sidewalk, and each corner, they had a little ramp that would go down to street level. You could go across the street and up the other ramp. And so I was just doing a steady little pedal as I would go up the ramp, across along the block, down the ramp, across the street, up the other ramp. And because there was such low traffic right then, I didn't really need to stop at any of the streets. I probably should have for safety reasons, but I was riding, glide down, cross the street, go up and on the next block. And I was only 1 or 2 streets away from our street when I saw that there was a small rock in the street. Well, I had learned to pull back on my handlebars so that I could lift the front of my bike, and this would let me bump up curbs. This was only a little rock. I could easily bump over that. In fact, I aimed for it so I could bump over it. And as I got close to the rock, I leaned back, pulling up on my handlebars, and my bike moved back with me, except for the front tire, which continued going straight ahead, leaving me nothing but the front forks of the bike, which came down, stuck into the road, stopping the bike immediately. However, I continued doing a beautiful dive up over the handlebars and planted my face into the pavement. Well, a car had just turned the corner a little bit before I did this. And the driver of the car stopped and was going, "Oh no, I hit him." I couldn't talk. I was just so much in agony of planting my face into the pavement. And I couldn't tell him, "No, you didn't hit me." Well, I suppose it was his wife who got a blanket out of the car and she put it under my head to try and make me a little bit more comfortable. I had been rolled over onto my back at this point. And one of the people that lived nearby said, "I've called the ambulance. I'm lying here blubbering. I just want to go home." And I had always wanted to ride in an ambulance. It looked so exciting and fun. But I didn't want an ambulance. I wanted my mother. I wanted to go home. Well, the ambulance arrived, and one of the boys that was in school with me rode home to let my mom know what had happened to me. Well, my mom arrived just as they were loading me into the ambulance. And she took off chasing the ambulance. And I'm lying here in the ambulance. Well, I should be enjoying the experience, except that my face hurts. And The attendant in the ambulance keeps asking me, "What's your name? What is your address? What is your name? What is your address?" And I keep telling him exactly the same thing over and over and over again. He was probably trying to keep me from going into shock, but I didn't want to keep repeating my name and my address and my telephone number. Well, Mom pulled in right behind the ambulance at the hospital and came in with us. And the doctor looked over the scrapes and bruises on my face. I had a very large, fat lip. It's swollen up by now. That was the worst damage. He took off the bandages the ambulance attendants had put on me, cleaned me up a little bit more, and put new bandages on. And then I was free to go home with my mother. Well, that night I was at home with my big fat lip sticking out, making it hard to talk. And my mom prepared bean and bacon soup, which was one of my favorites, which I still enjoy. But as I was eating the bean with bacon soup, I could tell a bean was slipping out of my mouth. And to keep it from falling out of my mouth, I would move my lip, my lower lip, under my upper lip and try and scrape it back in, only to find out it was my swollen fat lip. And so, ever since then, whenever I've had bean with bacon soup, I've remembered how I took a swan dive off of my bicycle riding home from school. I should also note, one of the other kids was able to pick up my wheel and, holding the front end of the bike up, wheeled it home so that my bike was at home waiting for me. And my father was able to tighten the nuts that had come loose, allowing me to ride my bicycle again. So, yeah, that was my great experience of riding in an ambulance. I might point out that ambulances in the 1950s and 60s don't look anything like ambulances of the 90s and 2000s. Different vehicles altogether. Well, time for another story. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but we children had been pestering our parents for quite some time that we needed to have a dog. And our neighbor had a dachshund that was about to have puppies. And so we were promised we could have one of those dogs, one of those puppies. And so we were all excited about it. And the puppies had been born and had gotten old enough that they were able to move around on their own. And so we were allowed to go over to our neighbor's yard and choose one of the dogs. Well, these were just little tiny puppies, just barely walking around. And one of them was a black and tan and had long fur. And I blurted out, "Look, Rags!" Because that's what it looked like, a little bundle of rags walking around. Well, that was the dog we chose. And Rags was brought home, given a place to sleep, and some food and water. And we made a great fuss over him. And every time he ever got out of our yard, he'd go running next door to where his mommy was. But we had our dog Rags. And Rags remained our faithful and loving companion for many years. I believe he actually lived to be 19 years old. I'm not positive, but he was quite old for a dog. And we had, in fact, moved from California to Orem, Utah, before he passed away. And he was still our very loving dog right up to the end. He was starting to have difficulty then. And one day, my father and my sister Ruth Ann got into an argument over should Rags be put down. He was suffering. The poor dog could hardly move around anymore. We had him in a basket inside the garage under a heat lamp on a soft cushion, but he could barely stand up to go over to the dog dish and eat. In fact, we moved the dog dish so that he barely had to stand up and just eat from where he was. Anyway, that night, Ruth Ann and Dad had their discussion over what should be done about Rags. And Ruth Ann insisted that he had to be allowed to live his life. Okay, fine. Then my father went out to make sure Rags had food and water and came back in and said, he passed away just a short while ago. Having your own dog is a special thing, and I'm glad my grandchildren have that experience. Jetton and Isla are growing up with Ellie, the dog that Ramona got as when she first got married, before the children, and Jared and Kyle, Brandon and Caitlin all have Rusty, a beautiful little border collie, black and white. Yeah, dogs can be special things. I knew my parents, especially my mother, remembered having a dog as she grew up. I might as well mention it. My father was named Alma Richard Allred. He always went by Richard, since Alma was considered a woman's name at the time outside of Utah. And my mother went by Marion, although it was Marion Ruth Barker Allred. And my grandmother's name was Ruth, which is why Ruth Ann was named Ruth. But to save confusion, her middle name, Ann, was used, so it was always Ruth Ann. And for the longest time, I thought it was all one name. Now then, yes. When I was growing up, we would drive out to my grandparents' house sometimes or out on vacation. And one of the common entertainments we had as children we would ask our father to sing a song. He knew many humorous songs that he would sing for us. And we would beg him to sing a song. And we would beg him, sing Ragtime Cowboy Joe. And he said, oh, is that the one that goes, out in Arizona where the bad men are? And we'd go, oh, yes! He'd say, I don't know that one. And we'd have to beg him, and finally he'd go ahead and sing the song. And then we'd beg him to sing G.I. Biscuits. And he said, is that the one that goes, they tell me G.I. Biscuits, they are mighty fine? Yes! I don't know that one. And we'd have to beg some more and get him to sing that. And then we'd beg him to sing I've Been Working on the Railroad, and a host of other songs. I won't try to name them all. I found out later that my father knew different words than the official words that you can now find. And I think some of his words fit a little bit better, but they were the words I grew up with. And we would love to have our father sing to us as we drove along. Well, during this time period in the early 60s, one of the things that would be a common practice of the time, especially for teenagers, would be to go cruising, which meant that you drive up and down the main street of the town. And it was just a long line of cars full of teenagers driving down, turning around, and driving back through the main part of town. And my dad likes to do this. And we'd load up in the car, all the family, and go driving down the road and turn around and drive back. And every now and then, my dad would beep the horn. Beep, 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 beep. Good old shave and a haircut, 2 bits. And one day, as we were doing this, or actually it was night, my father went, beep, 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 beep. The horn got stuck and kept going and going and going. My dad pulled over, trying to figure out what to do. Finally, I believe a police officer came by and said, you've got to stop this. And my dad goes, oh, tell me how. And the police officer said, like this. And he yanked the wire off of the horn. Eventually it got fixed, I believe. But anyway, that was that. Let's see. I had another experience with a president of the church. My father was asked to bring the plans for a new stake center to be built up to the church administration building, where they would be approved by the committee and by the First Presidency. Well, my father had work that the owner of the business was a member of the church and had some connections up in Provo. So my father and I boarded a train in Pomona and rode overnight up to Salt Lake. And then from Salt Lake, we ended up driving down to Provo. Although I think we stayed in a hotel in Salt Lake, a travel lodge, in fact. And it was during the winter, and this was my first time seeing snow fall. And I remember coming out of the hotel room and seeing a white flake come down right in front of me. And I looked around and saw more. And people must have thought I was crazy, because I started screaming, "Snow, snow, it's snowing, it's snowing." And that was also the first experience I had with making snowmen. I only made little teeny tiny ones because I was packing the snowballs with my hands and then doing another snowball to go on top and a smaller snowball to go on top of that. And I had my hands freezing cold. And so I went into the building where my father was meeting with the other people from his business and ran the water from the drinking fountain over my hands and warmed them up. It wasn't a chilled drinking fountain, but still, it was cold water. But this was what my mom had told me to do when my hands were freezing like this, and it really worked. Anyway, we'd come up for this business trip, but also so my father could take the plans into the church administration building. And he had dropped them off there at one point, and he took me with him when he was to go and get the final approval. And I remember going into this church administration building and walking back to a desk where my father identified himself and explained why we were there. And we were given directions to take the elevator and go up, I believe, to the 3rd floor. And then we were to go over to the conference room and wait in there. And so we are sitting in this conference room in the church administration building and I'm looking at the pictures on the walls. I believe they were general authorities. And a elderly man in a light-colored suit came in and shook hands with my father and I. And I didn't pay attention to the conversation he had with my father, apparently announcing that, yes, approval had been given. And then he says, "I want to show you something. Come over here to this window." And he went to one of the windows, pulled the curtain aside, and we could look down into the pit where the new church office building was under construction. The foundations were down in this pit, and they were working on it. And he made the comment that some people had asked why they were building such a big building for the church office building. And he says, one of the answers is, we need a place to keep all the rumors about the church. It wasn't until later that I realized that this gentleman, the elderly man who had come in and shaken hands with me, was David O. McKay, who was the first president of the church I can remember. I remember watching General Conference on television, and our mother would keep us paying attention to General Conference by saying, "Okay, watch, because every now and then the camera will show the people in the tabernacle. Look and see if you can see your father." And we would look, and we could usually spot him during the conference sessions we got to see by television. Time to look for another story here. My Aunt Mildred and Uncle Boyd worked many different places around the world. They worked in India, that is, my Uncle Boyd did, and took the family with him. And he worked in Venezuela and Jamaica. Well, one day it was time for them to return from one of these overseas assignments, and we all went to the Los Angeles harbor to meet the ship that they were coming back on. They had decided to travel by ship rather than by airplane. And we arrived at the harbor, and their ship was out a ways in the harbor, and the dock where we were supposed to meet them was occupied by an old tramp freighter. that was loaded with scrap metal. And it had broken down. And they were doing repairs on it so it could leave the harbor. And we had to wait for that before the ship my aunt and uncle were on could be brought into dock. And I remember waiting with my cousin Cheryl, and I was actually worried at this time that I wouldn't recognize my aunt and uncle because it had been years since I had seen them. Well, eventually, the ship full of scrap iron, or scrap steel, got underway and left. I found out that it was, in fact, going to a place where the ship itself would be scrapped and they would produce new steel from it. But we waited, and in a while, the ship that my aunt and uncle were on came in. Now, this was what was called a banana boat. And at the time period, these were a little bit better than the tramp freighter that had been in there. The banana boats were called that because they frequently hauled bananas, but they would also haul other cargo, and they had regular routes that they would sail, and they would take passengers. At this particular time, the banana boats were starting to go out of favor because people would fly where they wanted to go now. But my aunt and uncle traveled on this boat, and after it docked, we met them, and I was relieved that I recognized them. My Aunt Mildred and Uncle Boyd were people I hadn't seen for several years, but now I recognized them, and they invited us to go up on board, and they would show us the ship they had come on. Now, this was not a cruise liner like you might go on today. This was a working freighter. And there were cabins that were for the passengers. There was deck space that the passengers could go on. There was even a swimming pool. It looked like a great big tank of water, which is what it was. But it was actually pretty nice. And they showed us the dining room. Now, on cruise lines, they might have more than one dining room, and they're huge affairs because you have so many people. This was actually just big enough for the crew of the ship and a few passengers, but very nice. Which, of course, my aunt and uncle joked this meant that they got to sit at the captain's table every night, which on the bigger cruise lines or bigger passenger ships, the captain's table was something very special, that you had to be the hoity-toity or the upper crust in order to sit at the captain's table, and sometimes only once during the entire trip. But the captain's table it was. Now, my aunt and uncle, having been in Venezuela, brought back with them a parrot. It was a young bird that they had obtained while they were there in Venezuela, and they had sailed on through the Panama Canal and up the west coast, and now they had the parrot. And my uncle described how at one point the parrot was put on a conveyor belt, to go up into the cargo hold of the ship. And a little while later, it came down a different conveyor belt. And they put it back on the first conveyor belt, back up into the ship. And a little while later, it came down the other conveyor, because they were loading and unloading at the same time. And whoever it was kept putting the parrot back to go down. Finally, they just let my aunt and uncle carry the parrot up to their room, their cabin. Now, the parrot was named Lorito, which I understand is Spanish for little boy parrot. We had a tradition of breaking a piñata on Christmas Eve. Now, a few days before this, I was at home, and my younger brother did something that set me off. I don't know what he did, but I remember chasing him in circles around our living room as he yelled out, "Help! Help! Help!" And I continued to storm after him until he finally ran out. And, the reason I'm telling that little incident is because of what happened during the piñata party. We had a hook set up in close to the middle of our living room that we could suspend the piñata from, and by pulling on a rope we could raise and lower it. And this particular year, the piñata was a Santa Claus. And of course, the youngest children always had first go. And I remember that it was my sister Beth's turn, and she was blindfolded and trying to hit the piñata, and we were yelling encouragement to her, which was, of course, causing a lot of uproar in our living room. But we were yelling things like, "Hit him again, hit him again," and "You broke his leg, hit him again." And she was swinging as hard as she could, and the telephone rang. Now, this added to everything else going on, set off the parrot. And the parrot started yelling, "Help! Help! 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 Help!" My father answered the phone to the background of all that, and there was silence after he said hello, and then the stake president said, "Who are you murdering over there?" As we continued to yell, "Hit him again, you broke his leg, hit him again." And the parrot continued to go, "Help, help, help." Well, anyway, since I'm not talking about the piñata, or the parrot, I should say, the parrot eventually moved off with my sister Ruth Ann. She had become the primary caregiver and was the one who was always holding the parrot or letting it sit on her shoulder. And she had ended up moving to New Mexico. And while there, she discovered that the parrot's name was really Lorita, because she started laying eggs. And so instead of being a boy parrot, it was a girl parrot. Now, there were a few other stories that I forgot to tell before. So, meanwhile, back in Sequoia, the location of our annual family vacation, one of the things that happened when I was very young is that my parents had seen what looked like a good campsite, and so they dropped my older sisters and I off to stay in the campsite and hold it so it wouldn't get taken by anyone else, while they went and checked to see if another site was available. Well, while we were there, a couple of deer came wandering into the campsite. Now, my sisters and I had a bag of potato chips, and my sisters decided it would be a good idea to offer potato chips to these deer. The deer loved the salty potato chips, and they kept coming toward us, demanding more and more. And finally, the three of us were standing on top of the picnic bench or table that was at the campsite and trying to get the deer to go away and leave us alone. Eventually, our parents came back and the deer left, and we continued our regular camping trip. It was actually some years later that we were again camping there, and we had gone to one of the local sites, a location called Morro Rock. And this was a big outcropping that stuck up high from the side of the mountain. And so climbing up Morro Rock was always something we did. And our parents, when we were really small, would tie us all together with a rope. And we'd hike up. It wasn't a hard hike, but we'd get to the top. We'd feed the chipmunks up there. We always had Nilla wafers to feed them. And my father would recount how he had climbed up Morro Rock when he was a teenager, and there had not been a railing around it like there was when we went up. And so he went out a little further toward the point of Morro Rock, spread his sleeping bag in a space in the rock that sort of a V shape, and he lay down and slept the night on top of Morro Rock. And obviously survived to tell the tale, which he did many times. One of the years when we were up there, we had come down from Morro Rock, and we piled into the van, our blue Greenbrier van, and drove off to our campsite, only to discover that David was not with us. So we all drove back to Morro Rock and spent a while searching for him, climbing the rock and walking around the parking area calling his name. Finally, it was decided that we would go back to the campsite, and my mom and us children would stay there while Dad went to get the rangers to help hunt for our brother. When we arrived, there was David eating a snack. He had just simply walked home because the trail connected. And he knew that. So, no big manhunt, but we lost David for a little while. Now, let's see. Oh, yes. One of the other places we always went to at Sequoia was Crystal Cave. This was a cave down the mountain away, and the entrance to the cave was very large, and across the entrance was a large gate. And the gate was made of iron and welded together in the shape of a spider web. And then the device for opening the gate was the spider in the middle of the web. You would grab the legs and turn it, and that would let the gate swing open. And of course, they would lock it when tourists weren't going to be held. But we enjoyed going out down into Crystal Cave, and the tour was always pretty much the same. We'd get deep into the cave, and they'd turn off the lights and show us what darkness really was. And there was one part of the trail that was called Fat Man's Misery, and we always thought it was funny. Our father was a little on the heavy side, and he never had any trouble getting through Fat Man's Misery. It was just a very narrow place in the trail where rocks came in from the side, but it wasn't really ever a problem for anybody that was walking down there. When Donnell and I were at a family reunion which was held in Sequoia some years later, Donnell was pregnant, and we went down to Crystal Cave, and Donnell was very pregnant, and so she was having a little bit of a difficulty, especially when it came to climbing out. But we were the last tour of the day, and so the people who were running the tours kept telling us, no, you can't stop, keep going, because they wanted to get home. And poor Donnell was very tired and uncomfortable with being that pregnant. Well, let's see. One of the things, when I originally told stories about my father singing songs as we drove in the car, I had decided not to try singing any of the songs. But I think it's only fair that I try to sing them a little bit. I don't think my voice is going to be too terrible. And it's the only way I know of to actually record what I remember of the songs. They weren't very long, mostly. The first one is called The Weatherman. It might have a different title. It was a song written for the meteorologists in the Army Air Corps, which my father was during the Second World War. And the song went something like this. Oh, the day was wet. Let me see. Oh, I'll never forget the day was wet. The general wanted to fly. He said, my boy, is it okay for me to go on high? When I said, no, it's going to snow, you should have seen him frown. Oh, I'm the only one who ever kept the general down. We are the men, the weathermen. We may be wrong, oh, now and then, but when you see our planes on high, you will know that we're the ones who let them fly. Another song that we frequently asked him to sing was Ragtime Cowboy Joe. And I don't remember all the words. And when I've heard it performed, I found out that there were several versions of it. But basically, it went something like, out in Arizona where the bad men are, the only thing to guide you is an evening star. The roughest, toughest man by far is Ragtime Cowboy Joe. He always sings a ragged music as he swings back and forth in the saddle of his horse. Pretty good horse. There's something about the meter of the roar of his repeater, how it runs, and the western folks all know he's a highfalutin, sure-shootin' son of a gun from Arizona. That's some cowboy. Talk about your cowboy, Ragtime Cowboy Joe. Another one of the songs was also from my father's time in the military. They tell me GI biscuits, they are mighty fine. One rolled off the table and killed a pal of mine. I don't want no more of this army life. I just want to go home. Well, they tell me GI coffee, it is mighty fine. good for cuts and bruises as black as iodine. I don't want no more of this army life. I just want to go home. And he liked to sing Working on the Railroad with a few added words. I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. I've been working on the railroad just to pass the time away. Up so early in the morning. Oh dear, I got the words wrong. Can't you hear the captain shouting, Dinah, blow your horn. Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow your horn? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow your horn? Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah. Someone's in the kitchen, I know. Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah, strumming on the old banjo and singing fee-fi, fiddly-I-o, fee-fi, fiddly-I-o, fee-fi, fiddly-I-o, strumming on the old banjo. A word of explanation. When I was a child, I thought Dinah was the name of the train engine, so it was going to blow its horn. But actually, Dinah was probably the name of the cook, and blowing the horn, which was a little tin horn, was the way of letting the work team know it's time to come and eat. So, of course, the workers were waiting anxiously for Dinah to blow her horn. Now, there's another part to working on the railroad that my father had. I had a dog, his name was Bill, a-working on the railroad. He ran away, but I'm here still, a-working on the railroad. I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. I've been working on the railroad just to pass the time away. Can't you hear the captain shouting, rise up so early in the morn? Can't you hear the captain calling, Dinah, blow your horn? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow your horn? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow your horn? Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah. Someone's in the kitchen, I know. Someone's in the kitchen with Dinah, strumming on the old banjo. My father also sang a verse. I had a dog, his name was Bill, a-working on the railroad. I ran away and he's there still, a-working on the railroad. He sometimes liked to put in silly or nonsense lines. Well, let's see. Another one he would sing was, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more, ain't gonna rain no more, so what in heck if I get wet, ain't gonna rain no more. There was a mother kitty who ate a ball of yarn, and when the little kittens came, they all had sweaters yarn. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more, ain't gonna rain no more, so what in the heck if I get wet, ain't gonna rain no more. There was a mother billy goat, she ate an old tin can, and when the little kitties came, they all drove Ford sedans. Oh, it ain't gonna rain no more, no more, ain't gonna rain no more, so what in the heck if I get wet, ain't gonna rain no more. And then there was Bill Grogan's goat. Bill Grogan's goat was feeling fine, ate 3 red shirts from off the line. Bill took a stick and gave him a whack and tied him to the railroad track. The whistle blew, the train drew nigh. Bill Grogan's goat was doomed to die. He gave 3 groans of awful pain, coughed up the shirts, and flagged the train. Smart goat stopped the train by putting out some red flags. Okay, Let's see. What else was there? Oh, yes. Someday I'm going to have to find a version of this, and maybe I'll have to check on YouTube and see if I can find a video. There was a cartoon done of Popeye the Sailor Man to the words of this song, with Popeye and his arch enemy or nemesis, Bluto or Bruto, depending on what name was being used at the time. But I'll sing the song as much as I can remember. The sons of the prophets are brave men and bold, and quite unaccustomed to fear. But the bravest of all was a man by the name of Abdul the Bulbul Amir. Now there are Muscovites aplenty in the ranks that are led by the Tsar, but the bravest of all was a man by the name of Ivan Skavinsky Skavar. Now one day this bold Russian, he shouldered his gun, and with his most truculent sneer was looking for fun when he happened to run into Abdul the Bulbul Amir. Said Abdul, my friend, has your life grown so dull that you now wish to end your career? For infidel know you have trod on the toe of Abdul the Bulbul Amir. Said Ivan, my friend, your remarks in the end will avail but little, I fear, for you ne'er will survive to repeat them alive. Quoth Abdul the Bulbul Amir, I know that doesn't quite make sense, having one say it and then saying it's the other. But that says I remember the words. Anyway, they fought all that night, 'neath the pale mellow moon. The din it was heard from afar. Great multitudes came, so great was the fame of Abdul and Ivan Skavar. Well, the Sultan rode up, the disturbance to quell, expecting the victor to cheer, but he only drew nigh to hear the last sigh of Abdul the Bulbul Amir. Parzirovich, too, in his uniform blue, rode up in his new crested car, but he arrived just in time to exchange a last line with Ivan Skavinsky Skavar. Now a tomb rises up where the Danube doth roll, inscribed there in characters clear. The stranger while passing will please pray for the soul of Abdul the Bulbul Amir. And a Muscovite maiden her lone vigil keeps by the light of the cool polar star. And the name that she murmurs so oft in her sleep is Ivan Skavinsky Skavar. That's several of the songs that my dad would sing. There were a lot of others, but I'm not going to try and remember them now. It would take too much time. I told about my mother getting all the keys and using them as incentives for us to learn to read. And I believe I mentioned that one of my teachers decided I couldn't read. She had gone in reverse alphabetical order of last name, so that I was the last person to read. And I had been very bored listening to the other students stutter their way through Dick and Jane. And I had finished reading Our Reader, the one that was supposed to last us the year. And when it finally was my turn, the teacher says, "Okay, James, it's your turn." And I said, "Okay, what page are you on?" And instead of telling me what page, she said, "Well, if you can't keep up with us, we'll let somebody else read. And they went on around the circle again. And the teacher decided that I was turning the pages much too fast to really be reading. Therefore, I really couldn't read. And she sent a note home. James can't read. My parents wrote back, yes, he can. He reads all the time at home. And she wrote back, no, he can't read. He only plays with the books. And I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I remained in the slow reading group because the teacher, although she finally admitted I could read, knew that I must not be able to read very well because I was simply turning the pages far too fast to be properly reading. I personally think I was much faster than anybody in the fast reading group. And it was just because I had learned to read and was very interested in some of the stories, at least the advanced stories. That was another problem. Our classroom was used for storage for some of the books that were used in the upper grades in elementary school. You know, like third and fourth grade, second, third, fourth. And so I was grabbing these books and reading them, and obviously turning the pages much too fast to be truly reading, and therefore not really able to read. Now, another thing that convinced my teacher I wasn't able to read properly was that my spelling was atrocious. Now, there's an explanation for that. When I was learning the spelling rules at first in the class, there were always exceptions to the rules. And I decided that if there were exceptions, then it wasn't a real rule at all. And so other than learning I before E except after C, and then forgetting to learn any of the exceptions, I refused to learn all these spelling rules that hopefully would have made me a better speller, and my spelling was totally phonetic, which I knew what I meant, but it didn't look like the words that were supposed to be. And I had trouble with my spelling through most of the time I was in school, even all the way up into college. And I would take remedial spelling. Interestingly enough, in junior high and high school, they kept putting me into remedial reading because if his spelling's that bad, he needs to improve his reading, which I didn't mind at all since I could read anything I wanted to, as much as I wanted to. I got an hour a day to sit in the library and read the book. Well, eventually, my spelling has improved. I've probably told both of these stories before, but the thing that helped me improve my reading was writing. The more I wrote, and especially once we had word processors with the ability to do spell check, the more I learned to properly spell words. Basically, I guess, I memorized them. Although, in order to spell them correctly, I have to write them out. I can't just rattle off the spelling. Not always, although I did learn Piano for piano. Well, let's see. I've got a little bit more here to talk about. And I already talked about the early attempts at writing and poor spelling. Well, the thing was, my early attempts at writing, I would show what I had written to somebody, my older sisters or my parents, and I wanted them to read it and tell me what they thought about what I had written. And all I ever got was, you misspelled this word. You misspelled this word. You misspelled that word. And it was very frustrating for me. And for some reason, I didn't explain to them, I want you to tell me what you think of the story. And so actually, I gave up writing for quite a while. Luckily, when I was in high school, I did take it up again and made some headway on a story, which someday I'm going to go ahead and finish. I'm going to have to do it pretty soon. But at any rate, now writing is my hobby. My spelling is greatly improved, and I enjoy writing my stories. I like seeing them out on paper. Now, when I was very young, our family had 2 bicycles, a very small child's bike and a larger adult-size bike. Well, being the third youngest, or third oldest, I guess, my older sisters would take off on the smaller bike, which was the right size, and I had some attempts made to help me learn to ride a bicycle, but it's not easy at first to learn to pedal and get things going, and so I pretty much stuck with the tricycle we had. This was before big wheels. And I would ride that. Eventually it got to the point where I was big enough that my knees were hitting the handlebar as I pedaled the tricycle. So I remember one day being very determined that I would learn to ride the bicycle. And I got the large bicycle. It was of a style known as a woman's bike because there was no high bar connecting from the base of the seat up to where the steering wheel was. It had a opening, supposedly so that a woman wearing skirts could ride. That had been the way it was when the bicycle was built. I don't know that such a bicycle could be found in a modern bicycle shop. But anyway, I would wheel the bicycle in the street next to the curb. Then I'd make sure that one of the pedal nearest me was up, just ready to be pushed down. Then, holding onto the handlebars, I would leap up, pushing down with the one foot, getting my foot onto the other pedal as it came up, and repeated this again and again and again, usually crashing, but not getting hurt. It was just a matter of that I couldn't get going fast enough to keep the bicycle up, and I hadn't learned to properly balance yet. But I kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And I don't know how long I did that. I spent a good part of the morning, I believe. But at last, I got up to where I could ride the bicycle. I was so proud of myself. I rode up and down, back and forth in front of our house many times and called for my mom to come see me. And, well, I've enjoyed bicycle riding up until I was an adult, and I haven't ridden a bicycle, since Donella and I lived over on Dakota Avenue. And at any rate, that was my experience with learning to ride a bike. Now, let's see. I want to tell some of my mom and dad stories. And one of the stories was that when I was very young, I would, for some reason, come to the front door of the house and knock to be let in. Maybe I wasn't quite skillful enough with the doorknob. I don't know. But I would knock on the door, and my mother would come. She'd open the door and look at me and say, "No fish today. Come back Friday," and close the door. And I'd go, "Mom!" And she'd let me in, but she would tease me about knocking on the door when I lived there. There were other times when I would come and say, "Mom, what time is it?" Since not learning to read a clock yet, I would ask my mom, and sometimes she was doing the dishes or cooking, which meant that she wasn't wearing her watch. And she'd hold up her wrist and say, "It's a freckle past a hair." That was her answer all the time whenever I asked, "Mom, what time is it?" Eventually, of course, I did learn to read a clock and learn to tell the time. Nowadays, digital is everywhere. But analog clocks are still around. Now, let's see. About my father. Well, I told about the time that he took my brother and I to the Orange Grove to the welfare assignment and how we ended up going to Disneyland. There was another time that my father took me out to a baseball game. We went to the baseball stadium, which at the time existed in the LA area, and it was Dodger Stadium, and we were watching the Los Angeles Dodgers play. And other than the fact that it was the Los Angeles Dodgers, I don't know who they played or who won. I was more interested in being with my dad at a baseball stadium. And of course, I wanted hot dogs and popcorn. And so I wasn't really paying that much attention to the game. Well, and I've told a few other stories about my time with my father. I mentioned going to Havasu, and it was a ways away from our home. I believe we had to go, into Arizona. And so we would drive through the night and arrive at the trailhead while it was still very dark. And I remember my father and I lying near the car, looking up at the stars, and he let me rest my head on his arm. And I must have been 13 or 14 at the time, at least. But I remember looking at the stars with my dad. And this was about the time that I discovered I really, really needed a new prescription of glasses, because he and others would sometimes point out the second star or double star in the handle of the Big Dipper. And I couldn't see it. It just looked like a blurry star to me. And I thought that's how stars were supposed to be. Eventually, I got a better pair of glasses and later binoculars so I could look and see things much more sharply. But I remember spending the time that dark morning lying on the gravel with my father. Now, how did I meet Donnell? Well, there was a BYU ward that didn't have enough men. And so a gerrymander boundary was drawn, going along the street and then taking in the apartment building that I was living in. And so we ended up in the same student ward. And I remember being there at the student ward at the various activities, and I saw a particular girl. I thought, well, she looks nice. And so I asked somebody her name, and I had the hardest time remembering Donnell. Donnell. I was going, Donna? No. No. Everything but Donnell. But eventually I did learn it. And then I watched for her at another activity, which was not too long after that. And the reason why I waited for another activity is because she had left by the time I thought I had her name down. Anyway, spotted her at the other activity and walked over and started talking. And I said, would you like a drink? And she said, yes. And so I started walking over where the drinks were to get her one. And as I turned around, I practically ran into her because she had followed me over there thinking that I was saying, come with me and we can both get a drink. Well, anyway, we finally arranged to go out on a date. And then, because I happened to be in the eldest quorum presidency for that student ward, the next Sunday, I was at the ward council meeting. And the bishop started off by saying, well, James, when are you and Donnell getting married? We've only been on one date. Oh, well, luckily that didn't scare me off. And Donnell and I did date a bit more. And I was thinking seriously of getting married to her. And I decided, I want to see about getting a ring. What ring would she like? And so we went to a jewelry store in the University Mall, now University Place. And we looked at the different rings. We looked at the diamonds through the microscope. And there in the bright lights of the store, Donnell says, well, I like that one. And I said, oh, well, that's fine. And I didn't say anything else and just steered her out, and we went somewhere else. And she was rather sad and upset. She was expecting to get proposed to right then. Well, I went back a while later and says, I'm interested in buying that ring, and it has to be size whatever. And I got the ring, and Donnell and I had agreed to meet up. There was an activity going on at the Marriott Center, and we found a parking spot, and it was on the street just to the south of the Marriott Center. And we got out of the car, and we were walking across the street and talking. And I don't remember exactly what the conversation entailed, but I said something like, thinking of popping questions, will you? And I handed her the ring box. Well, she was so distracted and she was so convinced that I was not going to propose to her that she simply grabbed the ring box and continued walking. I had to get her to stop and open the box. And I never got the reaction I was hoping for, but I got the ring on her finger, other hand, and that was fine. And then after looking at it a bit more, she said, I want a bigger diamond. You see, the ring in the store had looked very nice and shiny, but it had a whole bunch of little teeny tiny diamonds. Anyway, I took the ring back and exchanged it for another one of approximately the same cost, but a bigger stone, one that you could actually see was there instead of the little chips. And that was the engagement ring, and there was, of course, with it a wedding band. Now, eventually, as we got older, Donnell's fingers swelled up and had to cut the ring off, which is why she doesn't wear a ring at this time. Even if we get a ring that fits, sometimes the swelling goes down and the rings fall off. So she doesn't wear rings at all now. But she does like to wear necklaces and bracelets. I thought of another story from my childhood. Now, being the oldest brother, but the third child, my older sisters took ballet. And Millie especially loved ballet. And since I was the biggest of the boys, I was drafted to help her do ballet. And I had to try and do lifts and help her with spinning like the professional ballerinas. And I don't think I was ever really a very satisfactory ballet partner, especially since I didn't try to do any of the fancy steps. But Millie had me help her with ballet several times. And let's see. When I was quite young, I had some friends. There was a family that our family knew, and they were the Hausers. And we would go and do things with them, and they had children about our age, and we'd play with them. Now, their boys had curly hair. And I wanted to have curly hair, I told my mom I wanted curly hair, and Mom said, well, if you eat the crust on the bread, your hair will become curly. That didn't help. But I asked my friend Jamie, how do you get your hair curly? And he says, well, I just run my fingers through it. I tried that a lot, and all I ended up with was messed up hair. But that was what happened. Now, there was one year when there was a church dance festival that was to be held. And my older sisters were participating in our stake, learning the dances for the dance festival. And they practiced and practiced and practiced, and I would watch the practices now and then. And the dance festival was to be held in the stadium at the University of Utah that summer. And we took our vacation up to Salt Lake and went to one of the campgrounds in the area of Salt Lake. The Hausers also went with us. And interestingly enough, at that particular time, that summer, we kept having thunderstorms. And the wind would blow and the rain would just pelt down. And we would be sleeping in the tent and the water level would rise, and we'd all get up out of our soggy sleeping bags and get inside the car and sit there watching it rain. It happened every night. And one day, when things were dried out some, we were in the campground, and my mother had gone in to rest in the tent. and the wind came up and started blowing really hard, and the wooden tent pole snapped, leaving a long, sharp piece of wood which came falling down and landed right beside her into the tent floor. My father used some tape. It was filament tape, not duct tape, but filament tape to repair the tent pole. And that's the way the tent pole remained for as long as we had that tent. But we were so glad that the tent pole had not harmed my mother. If it had just been an inch or two over, she would have been badly injured. Let's see. Oh, yes. The day of the dance festival finally came, and it was raining and raining and raining. But we went to the stadium and held plastic bags over us, or tarp over us, as we were up in the bleachers waiting for the dance festival to begin. As the rain poured down, and the announcement was made, okay, we're hoping that the rain's going to stop. We're going to have an opening prayer, and then we'll wait and see if the rain will stop in a few minutes. Opening prayer came, and by the time Amen was said, the rain had stopped and the clouds had been blown away. I remember just one tiny fluffy cloud still up in the sky as it turned pink as the sun was setting. And then when it was dark, the lights came on and the dance festival proceeded. I believe that was the one and only church-wide dance festival. The church was growing rapidly in other parts of the world even then. I remember also that we had a plate from a gift shop that had the temples of the church on it. The Salt Lake Temple was in the center, and around the edges were the St. George, the Manti, the other temples that existed at the time. The Logan, that's the one I was trying to think of. And included the London and the Los Angeles Temple, and the New Zealand Temple, and the Hawaii Temple. And there were all little pictures around the edges of the plate. And of course, that was it for a while. And then, since there hadn't been temples built for a while, Spencer W. Kimball started announcing temples. And everybody's going, oh, good grief, all these temples. There was the D.C. temple. There was the temples being put up everywhere. And we're going, oh, wow, the prophecies are coming true, temples to dot the earth. And we thought that was pretty cool until Gordon B. Hinckley came along and announced enough temples to make it up to 100. And, well, now we're well over 140. Well, a story about Donnell and I when we were married, and we waited until the summer to take our honeymoon trip, and we took a trip down to California. Now, it was while we were gone that my grandmother Allred passed away. So during the trip, since she was to be buried in the, I think it was the Longwood Cemetery, Anyway, it was a cemetery down in the L.A. area. We went there for a graveside service, which was to be held. And we were there, and it turned out that there was an error. The death certificate had gotten separated from the coffin, so they couldn't go ahead and do the burial without being positive this was the right casket. So although we'd had the service, the casket was taken back to the mortuary until they could find the death certificate or get a copy of it. And she was then interred a while later. And it was during this trip that Donnell and I stopped and went to Magic Mountain, which we thought was fun and interesting. I said Magic Mountain. I don't remember if we actually went to Magic Mountain that time, but we did go to Marriott's Great America, and I was used to pronouncing it Marriott. But while we were there, they kept saying Marriott's Great America, emphasizing the OT at the end, Marriott. And we had a good time there, going on the merry-go-round and various rides. And then we drove on down, and I was trying to find my aunt and uncle Sorensen, Margie and Stan Sorensen, and it was getting late, and I knew I was in the right city, but I wasn't quite sure where we were. And so I went to a 7-Eleven to see if I could use the phone. And as I walked in the door, the man at the counter said, "Go outside, use the payphone, and call 911. What? Go outside, use the payphone, call 911, and ask for the police to come here. Well, eventually I figured out, I better do that. And I went out and dialed 911, and soon the police arrived. And the man had been concerned because a group of people had pulled in, and he recognized the car and he recognized the people, and they had caused some trouble an earlier visit. No trouble this time. The police showed up. The people that had shown up made a few purchases and left, and that was pretty much it. But as a reward for helping him, the store clerk gave me a road atlas. Nowadays, we'd use Google Maps or Apple Maps or MapQuest or some other app to help us find the place we wanted to go. But back then, it was on paper, and I was able to look on there and find my aunt and uncle's address, and we really weren't that far away. But it was rather late at night when we pulled up to the house, and unbeknownst to us, my aunt was actually awake at the time. She didn't know she knew we were coming, but not exactly what time, and she was just not sleepy at the time. But Donnell and I ended up spending the night in the car so that we could go knock on the door in the morning. And that was our great adventure there. We did go to Disneyland, and Donnell decided that she was going to wear one of her pregnancy outfits. She hadn't been up to this point. She'd just been wearing regular clothes. But she decided it was time to wear one of her pregnancy outfits. And so since she was wearing that at Disneyland, they wouldn't let her go on any of the rides that were anything like a roller coaster, which meant that we couldn't go on Big Thunder Mountain, which I didn't think was that much of a roller coaster. It was fun, but it wasn't quite what I considered one. But we had a good time going various places, and we even went to Knott's Berry Farm, and if I remember right, yes, we went to SeaWorld Africa, USA, and had a good time there. Saw some of the tiger cubs that were being taken for walks on leashes to get them some exercise. And I remember visiting the San Diego Zoo with Donnell. We had a good time there. They put on a program about how the zoo animals were handled, and we learned the interesting fact that for the big cats, they would, when they were born, put them with a puppy. And the puppy would grow a little bit faster and be a little bit bigger and would assert itself as the dominant animal of the group. And then, since the dog obeyed the humans could tell the dog, make the cat go there. And the dog would go over and nudge the cat, and the cat would go, yes, I'll go over there. It was interesting to see the dog, now dwarfed by the big cats, the leopard, the tiger, and the lion. And yet the leopard, the tiger, and the lion still looked to that dog as the alpha. Well, I've told quite a few stories, a lot more than I had originally come up with. So I think I might call it good this time. I hope that these stories are enjoyable to the family. And if you hear them and you want to hear more, I'm ready to talk.